Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Georgiev from the GSMA. It is a pleasure to be here today. And first and foremost, a big thank you to Forum Global for hosting yet another excellent conference for the CIS region. I will be your host for the next 45 minutes. We have here at the GSMA plan a couple of very interesting presentations for you, followed by a Q&A session. And I wanted to kick things off by a very short introduction. For those of you who are not familiar with us, we are a global association that represents nearly 750 mobile operators across the world, as well as more than 300 companies that are part of the wider mobile ecosystem. Next slide, please. And next slide. Before I give the floor to my colleagues to kick these presentations off, I wanted to put a little bit in context what the mobile industry has been doing with 5G and where we're expecting things to be in the world. So by 2025, we expect 5G connections to be 1.8 billion, with, if you can imagine, a contribution to global GDP that will be almost 5 trillion. Now, to put this in context, when I joined the GSMA some 6 years ago, we were looking at a contribution at the time, at the apex of 4G, if you will, at around 2%. So in the span of just a few years, we have almost doubled that. So we can see the great potential that mobile has for global economy and connecting everyone. And all of this is, of course, made possible by the raw resource that actually makes mobile what it is, and that is spectrum. So without further ado, I want to give the floor to my esteemed colleague, Luciana Camargos, who is a senior director here within the GSMA Spectrum team that is in charge of all things future spectrum and WRC related. So, Luciana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and thanks again to Forum Global for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be here. I was just in a panel just now, so I might repeat myself a bit, and I would apologize for that in advance. But it's great to be here with you all. It's great to be talking about a topic that is of so much importance to us. So my role at the GSMA is I'm Senior Director of Future Spectrum, as you can see on this slide. And the idea is that my team looks for a spectrum that the operators don't have, the operators don't own, the operators are not using, that they might be using in 5 years' time, or they might be using in 10 years' time. Excuse me. I apologize. I'm very sorry. So they might be using in 10 years' time, and they might we might be discussing at the WRC or not, or countries might be discussing what future their spectrum hold and what future they will be allocating or they will be making available to operators. So next slide, please. At this conference, we have a number of agenda items. We have agenda items covering low-band spectrum, so you have UHF being heavily discussed. We have 2 agenda items at least that are discussing the range 3.3 to 3.8, and we have other agenda items discussing upper bands as well. So it's a very fragmented conference. It's a very busy cycle for us. We're incredibly busy at the moment. But what's most important for us is the need that we have to discuss C-band. We are here talking about C-band once more. Everyone is asking me why. Why are we talking about C-band? Why do we still talk about C-band? We talk about C-band because it's very important for the operators, because C-band became, without any of us planning or any of us knowing it became the launch band of 5G. And that's where countries are looking all around the world to launch their 5G networks and for their availability in the C-band. So if you look into the next slide, this slide shows a picture of what the radio regulations show today. So RR 2020, the radio regulations that came out of WRC-19, that has the results of all these conferences in the past that we have discussed, C-band, and there are many. And this is what the radio regulations show in terms of identifications. There are identifications into the radio regulations today from 0 to 400 megahertz. We note that in WRC-19, some countries added to these footnotes. We see, for example, that 400 megahertz, which is the darkest color in this screen, is currently 4 countries. There used to be 2 after WRC-15. So this is a picture of what countries have decided to do in the ITU within the framework of the radio regulations. But that doesn't show the real picture. And this is the point that we find really interesting. The real picture is in the next slide. And you notice, if you move to the next slide, then you notice darker. Darker means more. Actually, in this slide, we have a category for 500 megahertz or more. Why is that? It's because, well, in most cases, the band is allocated to the mobile service on a primary basis. In regions 2 and 3, it is allocated to the mobile service on a primary basis, which gives countries permission to use the band for IMT, and it gives the country permission to pursue their what they would like to do. Europe has an interesting situation because they do not have an identification in 3638, but they decided regionally, ahead of WRC-07, that they wanted to use this band for IMT. So they made regional decisions, as did, for example, the Middle East and Northern African countries. They've made regional decisions that they would like to use this band for IMT in 500 megahertz, actually, for IMT. So this is why we're here at for WRC-23 discussing C-band once more. There is allocations in 33 and allocations and identifications in 3334, in 3436, and in 3638, 3637 currently. Different around the world, lots of country footnotes. 3436 has wider harmonization, but 3334 and 3638 does have lots of footnotes around the world. And we see a big interest in countries around the world trying to expand their identifications to be able to use more mid-band spectrum. And that came with 5G. When we started discussing this band in 2007, we're talking about 3G. When we discussed that, or 4G maybe, planning for 4G, when we discussed that in 2015, it was LTE plus, it was 4G advanced. It wasn't, we were not talking about 5G back then. With 5G coming up, there was pressure on more spectrum to be identified, pressure on more spectrum to be made available. And that's why we see the countries, the plan for the countries vary so much, and it's so much more in many cases around the world than the identification themselves. This is an interesting point because we at the GSMA tend to think as WRC at looking at the future. It used to be, if you look at the first identification in 92 for 3G, the first implementation was in 2001, and actually mostly was after that. If we look at all the 4G identifications in 2000, the networks came live 2010, maybe a bit earlier than that, but not much, and mostly actually a lot after that. There are lots of countries that are still launching 4G networks today. So we used to look at WRC as looking into the future, 10 years ahead. This WRC doesn't seem to be doing that for many bands. It seems to be looking back, to be looking into the gaps of what WRCs could have done, but did not. And now the countries that maybe in 2015 felt they were not ready to make that decision, feel they're ready now. And that's why we have this agenda item. So next slide, please. And in terms of C-band, is an issue of cost efficiency. There's an ITU report that says that there's a minimum requirement for 80 to 100 megahertz for spectrum for IMT, and that the channel size impacts the number of cell sites. If you, instead of 100 megahertz, if you only have 60 megahertz, it means an increase of 64% in cell sites. That means an increase in the cost of the network. An increase in the cost of the network will increase the cost to the end consumer, to the citizen, because networks need to be built. And that's how we would be able to operate. And we did a socioeconomic benefit study on the global benefits of of the C-band. And in that case, we see that with an additional 300 megahertz on top of the 200 megahertz would mean 50 billion in terms of huge savings on 5G rollout. And this is why we think that the C-band is here today. The C-band is available. It is the launch band of 5G. And that's what countries are looking all around the world. Next slide, please. Just to finish with the timeline shows us that we are in the beginning of the process. That's actually, that marker should have moved slightly after than it is now. But the thing is, we are talking about the characteristics, we're talking about spectrum needs and propagation model. We haven't done a single study, and we need to do that. We will do that from mid-21 until late 22. We will be doing these studies within the ITU, and then we'll be writing the CPM text, and then we'll be able to make decisions at WRC-23. So one thing that we don't agree is that we don't agree with C-band for IMT because sharing is not feasible, or we can't. The studies shows that it's not possible. The studies don't show anything because there are no studies. There are studies that have been done for previous generations. There are studies that have been done in the past, but they need to be updated. And this is what needs happening now. Okay, so next slide, please. I will go back to my colleague Tai and Daniel, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luciano, for the very interesting presentation. So up next, we have Taher Ismailov, who is our Strategic Engagement Director for the Russia and CIS region, that will talk us through how Spectrum will shape the outlook for 5G in Russia. So Taher, the floor is yours.
Thank you for introduction, Daniel. And I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, Forum Global, for the opportunity to speak today. I'll speak about the importance of Spectrum for 5G development in Russia, and I will start with the data on the CIS region. Next slide, please. So as you can see, I'll speak here about the contribution of mobile industry to the regional economy. And in 2019 alone, mobile industry contributed $137 billion to the local economies, and that's around 6% of the GDP. And in terms of taxes, operators contribute around $14 billion. So if we look at the 5G adoption and the forecast from GSMA, it would be by 2025 lower than global average. It would be around 13% because operators here will start the deployments later. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if you look at the global situation around 5G, the 5G adoption, 5G rollouts and consumer adoption is going ahead of the expectations. So there are many countries that launched already the service, and the number of countries is growing, and most of the countries are launching the service in the mid-band spectrum, mainly in 3.5 gigahertz. And if you look at the adoption level, as I mentioned, it's going ahead of the expectations, especially in the countries like Korea, US, and China. And if you look at the expectations in terms of performance of the network, then in terms of speed, the expectations are met. And in terms of latency, the situation is not as good as expected, mainly due to the fact that most of the rollouts right now are non-standalone networks. And in terms of new use cases, mainly now the use cases are concentrated around mobile broadband and fixed wireless access, and there are some new use cases around AR, VR, mainly in Korea, and in China, operators are testing a lot of new use cases around industry IoT in 5G networks. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if we get back to the Russian market is highly developed market, and the penetration level of mobile technologies is around 90%. That is even higher than in Western Europe. And most of the subscribers here have more than one SIM card. Smartphone adoption is rather high, and it will grow further on. And still, operators in this region invest a lot in LTE networks, and they upgrade the LTE networks, and the LTE networks now are 5G. Most of the LTE networks in the region now are 5G ready, and by 2025, we expect that LTE connections will count on 73%, and 5G would be a tiny amount of connections because, as I mentioned previously, in the region overall, operators start later, but still it would be in Russia with the optimistic scenario around 20% by 2025. Next slide, please. Yeah, so speaking about situation around spectrum in Russia, I hope you can see the slide. So if you compare spectrum assignments before 5G era, right? So before 5G, Russia is doing relatively well in comparison with the rest of the world. The situation is not very good around the spectrum in sub-gigahertz spectrum because situation is rather complex. 700 megahertz are still not allocated to the MNOs, and there are certain limitations from the government for 800 megahertz. In mid-band spectrum, the situation is better. So before pre-5G era, Russia is doing relatively well in terms of spectrum assignments in comparison with other countries. And I expect these slides would be distributed further on, and you can check the statistics later on. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So speaking about spectrum for 5G, harmonized spectrum is needed in 3 different bands: sub-gigahertz for widespread coverage and IoT services. In mid-band, the kind of golden band is globally 3.5 gigahertz, and GSMA recommends to allocate around 100 megahertz per operator where it's possible in each country. And it's good balance, this band is good balance of coverage and capacity. And millimeter band, of course, it's specific use cases where ultra high speeds and super low latency is needed. And we see that there are a lot of different scenarios tested around the world in millimeter band as well. Next question. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so if we look at the spectrum assignments around the world, this data we get from GSA, Global Suppliers Association, the majority of operators are using spectrum in 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz, and only tiny amount of operators are using spectrum in 4.8, 4.9. Mainly it's MNOs in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Japan. The spectrum was allocated there to certain operators, but it's worth mentioning that this spectrum was allocated in those markets as an additional spectrum, not as the main band for operators to use. So they have, for example, in China, some of the MNOs have spectrum in 3.4, right? And then this band was allocated additionally to them. If we look at the devices, this information is not presented on the slide, then it's like 2 times more devices in 3.5 rather than in 4.8, but the ecosystem is developing very fast, and probably pretty soon it would be on per basis. If we look at the amount of spectrum assigned in different markets, you can see that on average, governments trying to assign around 300 megahertz of spectrum in mid-band, if we are speaking about mid-band isolated, right? And that some of the countries like Japan even exceeded this amount, allocating 500 megahertz in mid-band. Next slide, please. Yeah, so probably last month you attended our event, GSMA Tri-Curation, where we presented our latest study on 5G spectrum and mid-band, and we compared the adoption of 5G in 2 different bands between 3.5 and 4.8, the 2 bands that are being considered for the 5G deployment in Russia. And we did a study, we did a specific modeling, analyzing how many sites operators need to deploy in each band in Moscow. So we took Moscow isolated inside the Moscow ring, road ring, and analyzed the number of sites operators needs to build to cover the city with 5G. So as you can see on this slide, and then we extrapolated the number of sites per operator's capex that they need to invest in building those networks, and then OPEX to keep the networks up and running. And we did modeling, and on top of that, we did interviews with vendors, with operators globally. We used GSMA intelligence data to do this forecast. And as you can see, operators will need to invest way more money, almost 2 times more than in deploying, and in some cases, it's even 3 times more in deploying 5G in 4.8 in comparison with 3.5. And that's mainly due to following reasons. First reason is that in 4.8, the high densification is required. That reflects the law of physics and more limited propagation characteristics of spectrum in this band. Also, ecosystem and vendor supply in 4.8 is not as developed as in 3.5. As we seen before, it's only like less than 10 operators that are trying to build their networks in 4.8, 4.9, or not even trying to build the networks with those operators who receive the spectrum in this band. So now most of the vendors globally are concentrated on, upgrading and developing their equipment in 3.5. And that will be the reason that probably vendors will request premium to be paid for the equipment in 4.8, 4.9. And of course, the learning curve in 3.5 is way more fast because there are more networks. Vendors can crowdsource more information about the network's performance and upgrade their products in this band. And some of the technical experts that we interviewed also mentioned that probably there would be potential increase in energy consumption in 4.8, 4.9 in comparison with 3.4, 3.8 band for mobile operators. So all those criteria needs to be considered prior to deploying the networks and prior to choosing the band for the 5G development in a certain country. Thank you. That's it from my side, and I can answer the questions if any.
Fantastic. Thank you, Taylor, for the very interesting presentation. So now we're moving to the Q&A part of the session. We have actually a number that came in, and the first one comes from YouTube, actually. And this question has 3 parts. So how much more spectrum is needed to meet the needs for 5G? Apart from the C-band, are there other options? And what are the key priority bands in the region? So to kick things off, I wanted to say that at the GSMA, we are just about to publish a European report where we look precisely at how much more spectrum would be needed in mid-band. And to anticipate a little bit the results from that study, we're looking at anywhere between 1 gigahertz to 2 in order to be able to achieve that sort of speed and capacity needed to provide services. But I wanted to ask Luciana what are her thoughts on how much spectrum is needed, and what are the other options aside from the C-band?
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, so we're looking forward to this study being published because this is not something the ITU is doing at the moment. So we are looking to respond those questions, and that sounds about right, how much would be needed. The last time the ITU did a spectrum needs study was ahead of WRC-15, and we're talking about 4G, we're talking about 4G plus, we're not talking about 5G. So those numbers that we calculated back, and it was 1340 to 1960 megahertz, if my memory serves me right. These are massively outdated. So we're looking forward to coming to this new number soon. What are the bands available? So for us, we believe in technology neutrality. So that means all the bands already used for IMT type services will eventually be upgraded to 5G. So we're talking about well, not our band, but we're talking about 1700, 1800, 1900, 2100, 2300, 2600, all of them. And then on top of that, we have the C-band, so 3.3 to 3.8. Some countries are considering up to 4.2. We see that as a very important element for the 5G component. There are other bands being used and other bands being considered. So we have, for example, in some parts of the world, 4 to 5 gigahertz, or sometimes 4.8 to 5 gigahertz also being considered. And we have the 6 gigahertz discussion happening at WRC-23. So there's a number of bands being considered, but those bands, especially when we talk about 4.8 and 6 gigahertz, they are not for today. There is no equipment availability today. There is no market. There is no demand for today. Imagine that we started the C-band discussion in 2005. Maybe 4.8, 4.99 will be ready in 2030. We don't know, but this is definitely doesn't have the same market demand, the same harmonization, and the same economies of scale of the C-band. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciana. I think you're absolutely right. I think it starts with the C-band and then it expands from there. But going to you, Taya, so giving us a regional perspective, what are the key priority bands for the region from your view?
Yeah, so first, as I mentioned, the spectrum needs to be allocated in 3 key bands, right? In sub-gigahertz, the most promising band is 700 megahertz. And in Russia, we've got the discussions, not only in Russia, right? The governments adopted, across all CIS, adopted the plans to refarm the spectrum from TV services to allocate it to mobile communications. And this process is ongoing since, I would say, like 2012 or something like this. It's going very slowly, and the progress is not meeting expectations, right? I would say it's like this. But in Russia, at least, we have few regions where the government and operators are having pilot zones to test the switching of the TV services to the digital formats and allocating this band to mobile operators. And of course, these bands would be critical for massive 5G coverage in Russia. In mid-band, there are still discussions which band. The government is more inclined to use 4.8, 4.9 because this band is simply more free. But of course, the community and mobile industry believes that 3.4, 3.8 is more promising band as it's globally harmonized, right? And in millimeter band, we have a number of trials in 26 where operators test different services. So in these 3 bands, I would say there would be 5G development in the country.
Perfect. Thank you, Taya. We have another question from Alexei Potryakev from Vimpelcom. So his question is, does the 3.3 to 3.8 or the 6 to 7 gigahertz band have better chances for global or regional harmonization for IMT on WRC-23? And Luciana, that one is for you.
That's fine. I seem to be the WRC person in every meeting I go to. That's okay. So yes, it's very different stages of harmonization. So we believe that both will be harmonized, and either regional or globally. We see interest going all around the world. I attended a Forum Global conference in November in LATAM, and the 6-7 gigahertz is not massively on the agenda in LATAM. It was considered the hottest topic of the conference of the WRC-23, even though it's not part of the agenda. So we believe both have really high chances of harmonization, potentially global harmonization, but we believe they're in different stages. So we believe that 3338 started achieving that harmonization a long time ago, because of course, we first discussed it for WRC-07, and 6 and 7 gigahertz is new. It's the first time we're talking about it. So we believe that in 10 years' time, in a long way, maybe 5, maybe 10 years' time, we'll be able to reach harmonization, but that is a timing issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Luciana. That sounds quite exciting, actually. Taya, you talked about, you touched a little bit on the 700, and here we have a question from Yuris Rensis, senior expert from the Electronic Communication Office. So are there any new decisions about the 700 megahertz band for mobile services in Russia specifically?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we have a few regions where there are trials, and I think it's very region, right, where MNOs are testing it's for mobile services. And of course, there are ambitious plans from the government to free this spectrum for mobile MNOs, and hopefully 5G rollouts will accelerate this process, right? But we are not there yet.
Thank you. Thanks. So here we have another question from Alexander Todonov from CLT. So do you think the COVID pandemic has affected the time frame for 5G rollout across the CIS region? And when are we likely to see it widely deployed across countries? So maybe to you, Tahir, and then Luciana for a global view.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, right? Of course, pandemic highlighted the importance of mobile industry and the roles operators play for the society and the economy, right? We all started to work from home. We started, to study from home, our kids, and telemedicine is developing. And of course, the expectations from networks are now much higher than they used to be before pandemic, right? And operators in CIS region are delivering to those expectations. So, and on top of that, they were taking a lot of measures to simplify the life of people during pandemic. For example, they provided a number of services for free. It was like government services, some media services, entertainment, and so on. And also during pandemic, at least in Russia, they allowed to the users with the negative balance to continue to use communications and so on. So they play a very important role. And now I think government realized that operators are playing, the key role in the economy at this point of time. And hopefully it will speed up certain decisions on spectrum allocations in the region and might speed up 5G rollout to a certain extent, right? And we expect that in the region, the first markets to launch 5G would be most likely, according to our GSMA intelligence data, right? It would be Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus will follow them, and then other markets will follow quite fast, right? When one starts, then others follow. But as usual, Russia and Kazakhstan will drive this adoption.
Thank you. Luciana, what do you think about the global perspective on deploying across the world?
Well, from a global perspective, we've seen bigger numbers on 5G than we had before. So the GSMA actually had to review the numbers through the year. So we see implementations going all around the world. But there has been delays in terms of public consultations and in terms of new auctions and new assignments because, of course, the pandemic affected everyone's lives, and we've seen a delay in documents being published. So there's both sides of the coins.
Indeed. Thank you. We have another question, this time from Sławomir Sitek, Senior Specialist at the Polish regulator, who is asking, is the C-band free in Russia now for civil usage? Tahir.
Yeah, as I mentioned, 3.4, 3.8 is not free. Of course, there should be a big work on refarming the spectrum, right? Operates mainly occupied by different satellite services at the moment. For 4.8, 4.9 situation is a bit better, but still there is work that needs to be done in order to clean it up for mobile. And I encourage you to check our virtual stand here at the Forum Global Conference, where we present our latest study on 5G spectrum in Russia, where we provide the outlook on the spectrum situation in Russia and what are the key, recommendations from GSMA to the regulators in the country. So you can check those reports, and hopefully it will answer most of your questions. If you still have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll answer it.
Perfect. Thank you, Tahir. A question for you, Luciana, from Alexei from Vimpelcom again. So the 24.25 to 24.65 gigahertz is the only 5G band available in Russia at the moment. And he would like to know, are there any other countries where this band is currently or planned use?
Yes, we've seen huge interest in 26 gigahertz in all around the world. We're expecting a number of public consultations. There has been auctions in Europe, and then Daniel, maybe you can help us out with that. But yes, there is a number of countries, and I would, for example, highlight the US. is already operational in 26 gigahertz, but there is a lot of interest in that. So that has been a massive success of WRC-19, the identification of 26, 40, and 66 gigahertz, and we expect to see upcoming implementations all around the world.
Oh, indeed. In Europe, we're a little bit slow at the moment, especially given the current developments around the C-band, and of course the pandemic, which affected the region more broadly. So I want to return maybe a little bit to what you presented during the first part of the session, and really ask you, so why are we discussing the C-band again for a third time at WRC? It seems that instead of, and you mentioned this, instead of sort of looking forward, we're looking at the gaps that weren't addressed previously. Do you see this sort of happening in the future again with WRCs, or would they be able to take a much more longer term view here?
Well, we hope that won't happen in the future. So what happened is that in WRC-07, we discussed C-band for the first time. It was very, very controversial. And we saw some parts of the world like Europe saying we need 3438, and other parts of the world saying absolutely not. C-band is so important for satellite. We cannot even think about that. And at the time when we were looking at that, I was like, well, yes, today you use it for satellite, but will you be using that for satellite in the future as well? Is that how you see your evolution going? And lots of countries said, we're not even discussing this. And we saw some countries did the identification of 3436. It was actually the largest footnote of the radio regulations. It had over 90 countries in it. But it was not global, it was not widespread, it was not in every region. But then it was up to 36, even though Europe had decided 3438. And then at WRC-15, we went to talk about that again. And more countries were more comfortable about discussing the C-band, but other countries were still saying, no way, C-band is way too important for satellite services. We're not saying C-band is not important for satellite services. We are saying that we need to review the needs of each service. And if your service, if your country requires satellite services in the C-band for the, I don't know, for the future, maybe you are in that camp, but maybe your country satellite services are being migrated, for example, to KU, to KA. I come from Brazil. It's a very tropical country. We couldn't close a link in KA band in 2000. Look at all the KA satellite companies now offering good service in KA. So the system has changed. Everything has changed. But then in WRC-15, some countries were ready to talk about that. And we have all the regulatory conditions, everything there is applied around the identifications. So we hope that WRC-23 is a lesson for us. It's a lesson that had WRC-07 and WRC-15 done their job and looked into the future instead of the today, we wouldn't need WRC-23 to be talking about C-band. Maybe people will see that, but also maybe they weren't ready and they are ready now. So time will tell.
Thank you, Luciana. Absolutely. I think you're right. From a European perspective, the EU had, of course, harmonized the 3.4 to 3.8, and of course, they would be pushing for that kind of position, so it's understandable. But Taya, I want to turn to you a little bit. So we've been talking a lot about mid-bands and how important they are for 5G and its sort of first stages of deployment and so on. However, in the Russian CIS region, the C-band is particularly congested, if I can put it this way, with satellites, military equipment, and so forth, making it difficult for civilian use. And so the government has turned more towards the 4.8 to 4.99 as a potential alternative. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on what would be the different use cases, if you see any, and the potential complications of this band versus the more widely harmonized C-band.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for the question. I think in 4.8 and 4.9, based on the studies from vendors and technical experts, the indoor coverage would be worse, right? And the use cases now in C-band that most of the MNOs are developing around the world is enhanced mobile broadband for those MNOs that see the traffic is increasing dramatically on their network. So it's more efficient per gigabyte to build 5G networks in this band, right? To provide the services to the population rather than continue trying to meet those demands with 4G networks. And as for the 4.8, 4.9, those allocations that we've seen globally are mainly for either it's for private networks, right? For the organizations, and they're trying to build certain use cases for private networks, and again it's used for fixed wireless access, right? When it's more used like a transport link to the house, and then the final access port is Wi-Fi inside the building. That's the main difference, I would say. So it's not very popular that 4.8, 4.9 is used for massive coverage or for population use and so on at the moment, at least.
I completely understand. And I think the choice of choosing that sort of band, I think will obviously have an impact on, as you said, deployment and coverage. But another interesting topic that maybe is slightly adjacent to the spectrum that impacts it as well is the EMF limits. And I wanted to maybe touch a little bit on that, because to be able to deploy, you need to have certain power levels. And of course, ICNIRP came out recently with its revised guidelines for 5G. And I think the Russian CIS region actually have limits that are much lower than the rest of the world. And I wanted to hear your perspective about how this could potentially impact the deployment coupled with using a different band.
Yeah, in 5G, it would be extremely critical, right? The EMF limits, because you need to build more sites and the site density is higher. And with the existing standards like 2G, 3G, LTE, when you build 5G on top of it, with the existing limits, it would be really challenging. And again, I encourage the audience to visit our virtual stand, and we have another study there we have links to our different studies, right? And we've recently published the study on EMF in Russia, analyzing the situation around existing limits and what would be the benefits of changing to ICNIRP limits, right? And of course, it will be beneficial for the industry. And as you mentioned, in March this year, ICNIRP published the new guidelines highlighting that 5G and the bands used for 5G are safe with the existing limits for the population, right? And of course, it's a challenging process because there are a lot of fears right now around 5G and fake news. But hopefully, as population gets to know more about the technology, it would be possible to do the changes in this field. And some of the markets in CIS and Russia and in this part of the world started to take initial steps. Probably you've heard that in Ukraine, regulator is considering changing the limits a little bit, not to the ICNIRP level yet, but at least like 2 times.
Thank you, Teo. Indeed, you're absolutely right. The effect would be compounded with 5G. And as a matter of fact, we've had a number of countries in Europe, Lithuania and Poland, most notably, which had much lower limits. And they decided, of course, to revise them in light of ICNIRP's new publications in order to help deployment and coverage in the country, which I think will have a tremendous impact if that would be the case in Russia and CIS. But I know that we're almost out of time, so I wanted to give you guys once again the floor for maybe some potential final remarks before we end. So Luciana, do you have any final comments here?
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, so from the WRC side, my final comment is to say we're looking forward to working with the countries in the region to a successful WRC-23. It's so important for us, this collaboration with all the countries and the regional groups. We're looking ahead, we're looking into the future, and this sort of event and the regional group meetings are highly appreciated. So just wanted to thank everyone and to say that we're available, we're here, and we're willing to discuss the issues that are important to you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Teo, 10 seconds. Any final comments?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just would like to thank Forum Global for the great session. Thank you. And thank you, Daniel, for moderating. Thank you, the audience, for the questions. So, yeah, thanks a lot.
Indeed. Thank you, Taya, Luciana. Dani, it was a pleasure. And everyone who has been with us, thank you for being here and for the questions. We hope that you enjoyed it. And we look forward to speaking with you in another conference and working with you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.